Welcome back to Take It With a Grain of Sugar. In our last episode, we talked about metabolic health and why blood sugar responses can look different from person to person. Today, we're going one layer deeper into the biology behind those responses, focusing on insulin. Someone can appear metabolically healthy on standard glucose tests, while their body is actually working much harder behind the scenes. Today, we'll explore how insulin works, how beta cells compensate, and why insulin can reveal early metabolic changes long before they show up in standard tests. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. All right, let's dive in. So when we talk about metabolic health, one of the central pieces of metabolic health is insulin. So can you tell us a little more of what insulin is exactly and what it does in our body?
Yeah, so insulin is a peptide hormone. It's released from an organ called the pancreas, from beta cells within the pancreas. And its main role is to regulate blood sugar, to help blood sugar get out of the blood and into cells where it can be used for energy or stored. That's insulin's main job, but it actually plays a lot of roles in other fuels such as fat metabolism and just kind of controlling the overall energy regulation in the body.
So can we assume that insulin is one of the main central hormone for managing glucose and therefore energy at large?
Absolutely. Yeah. It is without insulin, glucose could not get into cells and therefore you wouldn't have energy. I mean, that's why insulin is critical for people with type 1 diabetes, right? Without insulin, you're not getting glucose out of your blood into your cells. It kind of acts like a key to open the door on the cells. Glucose comes in and then it can be used however the cell needs it.
And when we talk about energy and glucose, we think about burning glucose for energy, so we have more energy. But is it fair to assume that when we have too much energy, that insulin might end up being like storing in a different way?
Yeah. So insulin is an anabolic hormone. It helps the body to store things. So glucose gets stored in muscles as glycogen. Actually, it goes into fat cells as well and gets stored as fat, as triglycerides. So insulin is telling the body, we want to be in saving mode, storage mode. We might need this energy for later. So it is a very anabolic hormone. In fact, if insulin stays high all of the time, you're never really going to be burning fat. One of the things that insulin does is it suppresses fat breakdown. So if insulin is high, you're always going to be suppressing fat breakdown. You're not going to be able to use that fat as fuel. Instead, you're always going to be using glucose for fuel. Fascinating.
So insulin is mainly produced by beta cells or only produced by beta cells? And so is that the main role of beta cells in pancreas?
Yes, absolutely. So insulin is only produced by beta cells, yes.
I'm taking back what you said where like it's so central and too much of it or too little of it can be dangerous. So I'm guessing that our body has developed mechanism of management of that insulin. So you're mentioning beta cells as being the one who produces, so that would be insulin secretion?
Yes. So beta cells are what regulate the secretion of insulin, and it's very, very tightly regulated. The beta cells are amazing at regulating how much insulin is produced and secreted at any one time. So they have systems where they can sense how much glucose is in the blood. They actually help keep a basal level of insulin. So when we're in a fasted state, it's still important to have insulin so that the cells can still get glucose that they need. That's like that basal glucose. But then they respond quickly as glucose increases with secreting more insulin so that higher level of glucose can get into the blood.
When there's a secretion, so a quantity that's produced, is it fair to say that on your example of like a key that in some cases the lock on the cell isn't working as well anymore, and so how would we call that?
That is exactly how we think about insulin resistance.
Okay.
So you've probably heard that term before, insulin resistance. And what it means is the cells are not responding as well to the insulin signal. So let's say 100 molecules of insulin go out from the beta cell. Well, that used to be able to get all of the glucose out of the blood into the cells. Well, now the cells aren't responding as well. The keys aren't working in the doors. And so the beta cells decide, okay, I need to put out 150 molecules of insulin to go around and open these doors. And that actually helps and works for a little while just to have a stronger insulin signal. That's what we call compensation. So the beta cell is compensating by secreting more insulin. And that happens in the early stages of insulin resistance. The beta cells say, oh, I secreted this insulin that used to do this one job, and that's not working anymore. So I'm going to secrete more, and then blood sugar does eventually come down for a while.
From what I'm understanding is like there's a potential situation or scenario where my glucose levels in my blood look very healthy. Mm-hmm. When I go to the doctor and I look at my fasting blood glucose, I look at my A1C, and the numbers are in range, in healthy range, but is it possible that my body is then compensating in the background and that I might not know about it?
Yes, that's absolutely possible. And actually, it's one of the really frustrating things with our current healthcare system and the way that we assess metabolic health, because that early insulin resistance, the early beta cell compensation, and the increased insulin is going to keep your blood sugar looking pretty normal in those standard lab tests. And it can do that for years. It can do that for over a decade, that your beta cells are working harder and harder and harder, pumping out more and more insulin just to keep your blood sugar under control. So what's really important about the compensation is that's going on behind the scenes while a fasting blood glucose or HbA1c can look completely normal. So I think it's important for people to understand type 2 diabetes doesn't just develop overnight. It is a long process of the cells being insulin resistant, of the beta cells working harder and pumping out more insulin, so insulin's high. And it's this years and years of that process that lead to a lot of the problems that happen with type 2 diabetes.
Kind of a better metric of health is measuring your insulin. Why are we not measuring insulin and rather measure glucose as a proxy, maybe? Or
well, insulin is harder to measure than glucose, for one. It also has standards that insulin doesn't have. I mean, there's a lot of technical reasons that glucose is just easier to measure and has set cutoff values for these different things. But glucose increasing is a factor way down the line on this continuum as we go from healthy glycemic control to insulin resistant to prediabetes to diabetes. So it's basically until you get to prediabetes, they're going to tell you your blood sugar is normal, right, until it hits that threshold. But there's so many things that are still going on before that. So we don't test insulin mainly for logistical reasons, but you can have it tested. And I think more and more labs are starting to do that. One thing I will say, if you do want to test your insulin, there's no set cutoff ranges, and different labs can have slightly different values for what they consider normal. Mm-hmm. So you'll just want to check with your doctor and the labs on that. But it's really for insulin, you want to see what it's doing over time. You want maybe twice a year or once a year at your physical to get that insulin measure and then be able to see, is it slowly creeping up over the years? Because that's going to tell you, oh, my beta cells are pumping out more and more insulin to keep my blood sugar normal.
And is there anything you can do to improve your insulin levels and sensitivity? And
yeah, absolutely. So movement is a big one, and it doesn't have to be exercise. There's actually some interesting data that shows if you exercise one time, like a 30-minute or 60-minute bout, and then you're sedentary the rest of the day, it wipes out a lot of those benefits of the single session. So it's really more about moving your body more throughout the day, not sitting in a work chair for long periods of time. Just get up and do some marching in place or move for a few minutes every hour. That can have a big difference. the carbohydrates that you choose to put in your body. So choosing complex carbohydrates from whole foods over those simple, ultra-processed, high-sugar options, that is going to spike your blood sugar less, which gives your beta cells a chance to rest, right? So they're not working in overdrive trying to deal with that large glucose spike. And then also making sure you combine those carbohydrates with other things so you're not just having a carbohydrate shot. You have some protein, some healthy fat, some fiber to slow the rate of that glucose. And that's going to help spike insulin less as well, and help the beta cells not have to work quite as hard.
Really, so there's quite a bit of things we can do, and it seems the regularity of these small incremental improvements matter much more than we might think.
Yeah, another interesting one for insulin is sleep. So just a single night, a poor night's sleep can really make you be insulin resistant the next day. And that is largely driven by cortisol, so that's also related to stress. If you're very stressed out, if you're sick, if you have inflammation in your body, all of those things can lead to insulin resistance, which is going to make it harder for your body to deal with those carbohydrate loads.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think sleep is probably one of the things that affects me most in the way I feel hungry the next day. And I think it reminds me of one thing that I wanted to touch base and we didn't. So what are the factors that affect insulin, secretion specifically? Like you mentioned carbs and therefore glucose, I'm assuming that has a direct relationship on how much insulin is secreted. But are there other factors that also affect insulin?
Yeah, so glucose is generally the main one. That's what's going to cause that initial secretion. But free fatty acids from fat, certain amino acids from protein, those can also cause it, neurotransmitters. But what's really interesting is once glucose stimulates insulin secretion, you have the incretins come in. So incretin hormones are things like GLP-1, GIP. Those are part of these new drugs, right, that are out that are GLP-1 or GIP receptor agonists. So though the incretins cause the beta cells to secrete even more insulin. And in fact, that ends up being like the largest part of how much insulin is secreted. They call it the incretin effect. Glucose has to stimulate it first, but then the incretins can come in and do their job, and they potentiate that so much more. So 50 to 70% of how much insulin is secreted after a meal comes from that incretin effect. What's crazy, though, is for people who start to have metabolic decline, and particularly type 2 diabetes, the incretin effect can be cut by half or more. So you can see how if incretins are driving so much of that insulin response to a meal, and that's blunted by half or more, this is why these GLP-1 drugs are so effective for people, because they're basically restoring that function of the incretins.
No, that's insane. So what we would have thought being the first factor, glucose, you're saying that hormones like GLP-1 or other incretins have a much bigger impact.
Yes, so they potentiate the signal to even much more than it was from just the glucose alone.
And then on a side note, you mentioned neurotransmitters. Makes me think of probably smell and of course brain, but linking it to smell. So could I potentially have increases in insulin secretion by just smelling the good food, or is that even possible?
It is possible. So there's a phenomenon called the cephalic effects, the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. But it's not just insulin. There's a lot of other things that go on in your body during the cephalic phase that is essentially preparing your body for food. So anytime you smell food, see food, get those cues to your brain, your body starts thinking, "Oh, I'm about to get food." You probably have heard of, that famous experiment with dogs, Pavlov's dogs, where they would feed them, they would ring a bell, and then the dogs started to associate the bell with the food and would start salivating when they heard the bell, right? So humans essentially have that same response of when we know there's going to be food, our body starts preparing. So that's one of the things that's really interesting about this food environment that we live in, And we're just oversaturated all the time with food everywhere, the availability of food, the types of food, how palatable they are, and sights and smells. And that's all kind of making our body be in this state of always expecting food, which can have some undesired effects too.
I love it. Everything. I mean, when I think about what we just discussed is how intertwined insulin is with our metabolic health, and how like it's multifactorial of how insulin will affect, and that to me it's always amazing how contrasting the subtleties of our body with, and then how that contrasts with the overflow of overstimulation and the lack of subtleties in the food world we live in. It's like you mentioned, this overstimulation. I can just now almost picture my body being at all time being attacked, whether it is neurotransmitters, whether too much fat, too much, carbs, or, not enough exercise, and how that must affect these variations of insulin and glucose signaling in my body. So no, thank you so much for sharing. Really, really interesting. One of the biggest takeaways from today's conversation is that glucose numbers alone don't always tell the full story. Our bodies are incredibly good at keeping blood sugar stable, often by producing more insulin behind the scenes. That means metabolic changes can begin long before standard tests shows a problem. And understanding how insulin works helps us see metabolic health in a much more complete way. Thanks for listening to Take It With a Grain of Sugar.